Hi folks, welcome back. So there is something super interesting going on in MCP land and I quickly want to talk about it. Recently they formed the Skills over MCP interest group. Now, this is not even a working group. An interest group is a collection of people who are, well, interested in this topic, and this can graduate over time to a working group and then something that makes it into a standard. But this is still interesting because it codifies or tries to codify a very common and interesting and powerful pattern. As the name implies, the idea is to have some notion of skills served by an MCP server. If you don't know what skills are, I'll link to another video where I explain it, but basically you can think of skills as SOPs or standard operating procedures for agents where you can package procedural knowledge as well as code and other context and resources needed to perform some task. So I want to talk about why this is very promising, that there is an MCP interest group that's talking about this and what this is actually capturing. The top level headline, in my opinion, is that it is turning an MCP server into really a center of expertise rather than just a tools connector. Now, of course, MCP is most known for tools, but these tools usually ship without any expertise, in that it is a very common pattern to then add additional context, usually again via skills, that write out how to use these tools well. So MCP exposes tools, but not how to use those tools well or use them appropriately. The other problem is that if you have a skill that describes how to use the tools in an MCP server properly, that skill usually lives somewhere else in your LLM or agent setup. And so you have a discovery problem. You need to get to the MCP server and then separately also need to find and then apply the skill, which tells you how to use the tools in this MCP server properly. So this interest group is trying to use this notion of resources in MCP. Now we all know MCP primarily as a tool calling abstraction. That's the thing that took off. But MCP actually exposes three abstractions or three primitives. Tools is the most well-known one. Another one is resources, which is basically just data, so serving up files as resources. And the most well-known recent example of using resources is ChatGPT apps or MCP apps, because they serve the HTML and CSS and all the web UI required for these MCP apps as a resource. And then there's a third abstraction, which is very rarely used, which is prompts. So you can even serve up prompts via MCP. Now, one of the things that was super valuable that this interest group identified was the common patterns that we see when using skills out there in the wild. Now, one pattern is skills as helpers, and these are the kinds of skills you would typically install in your Claude Code or Claude Cowork setup, and they talk about how to use various local files, maybe read and write local files, how to use CLI tools. So these are the kinds of skills that will show up in something like Vercel's skills.sh, or even these higher level skills like Anthropic's financial services skills. So these can be thought of as skills as helpers. But there is another very common pattern, and that is what this interest group is really focusing on, which is skills as instructors, where you have a skill that talks about how to invoke existing tools correctly, how to make the best use of them. And that is what the thinking of integrating into the MCP standard. And so the complete picture that emerges is that you could have one MCP server that is a very well packaged repository of expertise as well as UI. So you have the tools, of course, and the tools let you get at data, perform actions via APIs, and so on. If this interest group's work comes to fruition, the same MCP server could also expose skills, which is procedural knowledge for how to use these tools well. And finally, what we already have out there is the MCP apps standard, which then says how you can show a UI served by this MCP server. And so then if you have all these three things packaged up in one MCP server, you have a very complete package of expertise, essentially, something that can do pretty high level end-to-end actions or combinations of actions, and then even show the results in a generative UI. That is the really exciting part about this proposal because it completes this picture. You had the tools, you had the generative UI, but you didn't have the procedural knowledge in the middle. I'll quickly go over this, but I'll leave a link to their GitHub repo, and the GitHub repo has a lot of documentation about the design approaches that this interest group is exploring. And there's some very interesting design questions in terms of naming, how these skills are served, and so on. But one of the proposals most getting traction is a simple naming convention, just like you had UI colon slash slash for MCP apps. The proposal is to have a naming convention like skill colon slash slash for skills. Now, there are already many different mechanisms that people have cooked up for fetching skills, finding them at runtime, serving them, hosting them, and so on. And there's a bunch of solutions out there in the wild. So I'm really hoping that if this kind of a proposal makes it into the standard, we'll have one uniform, consistent way to fetch and discover skills. I'll leave links to this interest group's GitHub repo below. I do think this is really promising because it takes a need that people had already felt of using skills to direct tool usage, and it's trying to come up with a way to bake it into the MCP standard. And if and when this actually makes it into the MCP standard, I think it's going to be really promising because it will complete this picture and turn an MCP server into this fully packaged center of expertise rather than just a collection of tools. So keep an eye on this, and I will see you next time. Thank you.